Welcome to One Last Take, a podcast about seeing film from every angle. Today's episode is a special one, since I'll be talking about one movie and one movie only, Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. Hope you enjoy. Welcome back to the show, where normally we'd be discussing a handful of new releases and maybe some other stuff I saw throughout the week. But as I mentioned up top, I'll be devoting this entire episode to sharing my thoughts on one of the most anticipated movies of the year, as well as my thoughts on Nolan as a director, just to provide some added context. And I'll start with the latter, because all of my thoughts and feelings on this movie tie into my thoughts and feelings on its director in sort of an unexpected way. And because of that, this is the movie I've been both anticipating and dreading. Let me explain. My history with Nolan dates back to 2005, with the release of Batman Begins. I was a teenager that consumed comic books and superhero stories of any medium with excitement and a never-ending hunger for more. And lucky for me, at that formative age, Hollywood was just starting to bless the big screen with adaptations of all my favorite heroes. X-Men and Spider-Man each got 2 solid movies, and a Marvel Cinematic Universe was just on the horizon. But when it became Batman's turn to be reimagined on the big screen, just as I was old enough to realize how silly Joel Schumacher's Batman Forever and Batman and Robin were, I was overwhelmed with anticipation. This new one, made by some art house director I hadn't heard of named Christopher Nolan and titled Batman Begins, looked like everything the pair of Schumacher films were not. It was dark, it was brooding, it gave pathos and a more thoughtful origin story to the character. The villains were more grounded, and there was an almost more of a focus on Bruce Wayne as a character than Batman. So I saw it, and honestly, I wasn't a fan. The action felt weirdly edited, the gothic fantasy aesthetic I fell in love with from the animated series and Burton's movies was barely intact, and that Batman voice. What the hell was that Batman voice? When I tried to discuss this with friends, they'd all say things like, well, he changes his voice to hide his identity, and this is just what it would be like if Batman was real. Well, I didn't want Batman to be real. I wanted him to be Batman. I wanted him to drive around in an impractical vehicle and chase cartoon villains against Art Deco backdrops while simultaneously struggling with his dual life as a vigilante. That combination of the silly and the dark is, for me, what made Batman Batman. But maybe I was wrong. Everyone else seemed to now have the Batman they've been waiting for, and I was feeling left confused, to say the least. And then the sequel arrived, The Dark Knight. A movie now considered one of the best of the century, and while I, like everyone else on the planet, loved Heath Ledger's Joker, it was the only thing holding the movie together for me. As for the rest of it, it felt like it was trying to be Michael Mann's Heat, while mostly ignoring the fact that one of the men involved was in a head-to-toe batsuit. I found it incredibly frustrating that Batman would just stroll into a scene with zero presence or gravitas. I think this bothered me so much because it kind of felt like an artist painting a subject he couldn't care less about. As I got older, I let a lot of those nerdy prerequisites go, which is something I think is good for everyone to do before experiencing a new adaptation of something you love. But while Nolan would go on to explore several genres that are right up my alley, I realized my main reservation with most of his movies was that he was almost more interested in using them as a vessel to show off his own clever ideas, rather than exploring what many people want to see from these genres. He strips the aesthetics and worlds of his films down to where it resembles something that's, in my opinion, less stylistic or defined. His sci-fi films care more about theoretical concepts than funky aliens and colorful planets. And he wants his action films to make your brain do as many stunts as the people are on screen. Now, of course, this is the same reason so many people love his work, and I think I could appreciate that too if I didn't find much of it so cold and mannered that it almost feels muted. Even the emotional highs of many of his films feel somewhat manufactured in a way I can't really articulate. Combine that tone with the sort of montagey editing and the big amorphous musical scores he often utilizes, and these movies just barely register as more than empty exercises that insist upon their own importance. As a lover of heightened style and world building in my movies, I've just felt a remove from his filmography, despite loving the types of stories he chooses to tell. Now again, this is simply my take, and it's something I can best describe as an allergy to his work. And yes, as a cinephile, not being a Nolan fan is probably my hottest take, and it's sparked many a heated discussion with fellow filmgoers in the past. I provide all this context to say that his newest film, the highly anticipated iteration of Homer's classic poem, The Odyssey, was always going to be the best chance I had at truly loving a film of Nolan's. I'm a sucker for a sword and sandals epic, I love mythology, I love a revenge story, and what is The Odyssey if not the original blueprint for all of these things, not to mention thousands of years of storytelling. As the hype around this film was building, I found myself increasingly optimistic that this would be the one. The barrier between myself and one of the most prolific modern filmmakers would finally collapse, and I could embrace his work alongside the masses. So I walked into the IMAX screening the way Nolan insisted everyone see it, nervous with anticipation. And 3 hours later, I walked out tired, exhausted, and completely blown away. That's right. Not only did I love a Christopher Nolan movie, but after a second viewing, I think I'm ready to admit that he's made a masterpiece. Now, before I elaborate, let's cover the basics for anyone who didn't read the Odyssey in high school. The story follows Odysseus, king of Ithaca, played here by Matt Damon, who after successfully invading the city of Troy, embarks on the long journey home. Meanwhile, his wife Penelope, played by Anne Hathaway, and their son Telemachus, played by Tom Holland, wait desperately for almost 2 decades for his return, as suitors take over their home and grow increasingly hostile. On his quest, Odysseus encounters many dangers, including vicious storms, a cyclops, and other mysterious threats, all while challenging the gods and questioning whether he really wants to go back home at all. The movie is, in every way, shape, and form, an epic. Not just in its scope, but in its technical achievement, in its brilliantly realized visuals, and in its operatic performances. And every craftsperson who worked on this film, from the sound engineers to the props department, should be celebrated as much as Nolan for helping realize his staggeringly ambitious vision. I know it sounds like I'm hyping it up to the extreme here, but this is one of those rare times where I truly feel like the work lives up to the hype. I've often found critics who use the word triumph sound a little pretentious, but it's kind of the word that comes to mind here. This doesn't just feel like something put together, it feels like something achieved. It feels like hurdle after hurdle was overcome to create this thing that sort of defies the complacency of modern CGI-reliant blockbusters. Every Christopher Nolan joint comes with some sort of headline about how he did something groundbreaking, but this is the first time where I feel like that hard work not only shows on screen, but is in full service of the story. In a way, it feels like Nolan's treated every movie he's made up until this point like he's making the Odyssey, and now he's actually done it, and what would translate as pure pretentiousness before just feels like earned pride and a truly great piece of art. Now, to justify all of the glazing I'm doing up front, I really want to dig into every aspect of this film, and for that I'll be getting into spoiler territory. Before you say you can't spoil a 3,000-year-old story, I'd argue that Nolan's interpretation of it is unique enough that there are indeed some things that can be spoiled here, so consider that my disclaimer. Now let's start with the most obvious thing about this movie, and that's that it looks incredible. Working with his recent frequent collaborator, Hoyte van Hoytema, Nolan shot this thing entirely in IMAX cameras, a first in movie history. And while I felt this was kind of unnecessary at the start, the way they juxtapose these extreme close-ups with these truly massive wide angles communicates the appeal to want to shoot it this way. In an IMAX theater, the image was almost overwhelming, but it was incredibly immersive and put me directly on the ships, temples, and gorgeous landscapes alongside the wayward Greek soldiers. The magnificent and fantastical imagery just feels unquestionably real when you're experiencing it on that scale. And speaking of the fantastical, the effects that bring these mythical creatures to life are spectacular. Every crucial set piece, from the Cyclops to the Sirens, is exactly as thrilling as you'd hope, with a slight twist on each one setting it apart. The Cyclops alone combined the use of a real 60-foot puppet and a human performance shot with forced perspective, and there's not a second of that scene that feels manufactured or artificial. As far as my eyes were concerned, the Cyclops was real. And scenes like this alleviated my previous frustrations with Nolan, where he would take on these massive challenges, but the film would still feel like it only half committed to whatever kind of thrills it was going for. But make no mistake, there are no compromises being made here. While this film is epic and action-packed, it's also horrifying at times, and the practical effects only elevate these moments into a more immersive and unsettling experience. Even more so than the Cyclops, Odysseus' later encounter with Samantha Morton's Circe is the stuff of nightmares, and the on-camera techniques utilized there are captivatingly grotesque. But more on that sequence later. There was never a doubt in my mind that this movie was going to be big and loud, but the actual scope is truly insane. It calls back to the Ray Harryhausen epics of old and even large-scale Hollywood productions like Cleopatra and Ben-Hur. There's nothing like knowing pretty much everything you're seeing on screen was actually there on the day of shooting, and it truly feels like a breath of fresh air compared to almost every other mainstream film in theaters right now. The Trojan horse, the caves, the temples, it all just places you there, and I really think this is one of the few stories where this all-in approach is almost necessary to communicate the heft of it all. Further pushing the immersion is Ludwig Göransson with yet another iconic score. He did my favorite musical work of last year in Sinners, and he might have even topped himself here with something even more ambitious, creating sounds from instruments that don't even exist anymore, and combining them with haunting synths and pounding drums. How he manages to create these scores that are so diverse yet entirely cohesive is beyond me, but I don't think it's pure hyperbole to say he's redefining the sound of mainstream cinema with every effort. No, everything I've talked about up to this point is kind of the stuff I expected to be praising. Where I really thought it might fall short is the screenplay. If that or the performances aren't engaging, then 3 hours of hollow spectacle is all this movie ends up being. And I, like many others, was a little concerned about the anachronistic vernacular showcased in the trailer. I'll admit I wasn't sure how I felt about Temecula referring to his quote-unquote dad in an American accent, but I think this was simply an attempt to express the universality of the story, as was the diverse casting and streamlining of some of the film's themes. Well, despite an awkward line here and there, the screenplay pretty much sticks the landing at every point. Another reservation I had going into it was that Nolan tends to play with time, and I was concerned that that element would muddy the waters of a tried and true narrative. But the way he implemented that tendency here is through storytelling and memory, both of which tie into the messaging explored throughout. Most notably, the way this applies to the sacking of Troy is both thrilling and profoundly emotional. The first half of the raid is narrated by Jon Bernthal's Menelaus and is painted as a triumph. But eventually we're treated to the second half of the story from Odysseus, and this is where years of his pain and regret are contextualized, as well as his underlying hesitancy to go back home. The way in which these memories of his fade in and out through the story is a masterclass in editing, and yet another touch that puts us in Odysseus' shoes. Or sandals, I guess. There's obviously a lot going on, but despite a 3-hour runtime, the film is perfectly paced, only ramping up as it goes along. You would think the film is long peaked after a series of set pieces in the second act, but the third act is so well calculated and built toward that the excitement and tension only escalates. Similarly to the fantastical set pieces, every character moment is exactly how you'd hope, with every reunion becoming increasingly emotional, and every confrontation growing increasingly more intense. It all leads to this finale that is both satisfying and cathartic, as though the audience themselves have made it back home. And it's a testament to the storytelling that even though we all pretty much know how this is going to end, there's still plenty of suspense and thrills and surprising emotion along the way. A big part of that emotional payoff is thanks to the small army of brilliant performances featured in the film, including Matt Damon, Anne Hathaway, Tom Holland, John Leguizamo, Robert Pattinson, Jon Bernthal, Lupita Nyong'o, Benny Safdie, Elliot Page, Zendaya, Himesh Patel, Charlize Theron, Samantha Morton, and Travis Scott? Yeah, Travis Scott is in this movie, and he's not bad. But let's start with Damon, who's an unlikely Odysseus, but he knocks it out of the park here. Playing the character is everything from an opportunistic trickster to a cunning warrior to a loving husband and father. The different moments he and Nolan decide to express each individual angle of this persona is entirely strategic in understanding the arc he goes on. Early on, when facing the Cyclops, it's clear his ego is steering the wheel. We know the legend he's established himself as, and it appears as though it's gone to his head. But as the story goes on, it's clear that that might be his desperation to forget the past and see himself as a hero. As he's humbled again and again by what he believes is word from the gods, he slowly starts reconciling with his own actions and facing his own trauma, even questioning if it's the gods that wrought all this on him or himself. All of this is to say, Damon's natural charisma keeps you rooting for him to find himself again, even when his flaws get the best of him. By the time he's returned home to ward off the suitors and reclaim his place by his family's side, Damon lives up to the image of a mythical hero worth telling stories about. Meanwhile, Anne Hathaway rounds out her trio of great performances this year with yet another showstopper as Penelope. She takes a character with an inherently passive role in the story and adds a ferocity that gives her as much agency as anyone with a sword. Holland, on the other hand, has an equally difficult job playing a character whose defining trait is that he doesn't quite live up to his father's legacy, but carrying over some of that determination and doe-eyed idealism from his run as Peter Parker makes Telemachus just as easy to root for as our other protagonist. Playing opposite these two is Robert Pattinson as the voice of the suitors, once again proving he can play a sniveling shitbag as well as he can play a leading man. Every role of his just further proves that he might be one of the very best working today. As for the rest of the ensemble, pretty much everyone rises to the challenge here and pulls their weight. But if I could call out a couple extra standouts, Zendaya gives a performance worthy of her fame with very few words, and Samantha Morton just grabs the movie by the balls in the 10 minutes she's on screen and doesn't let go. I don't know if I knew of her before, but I sure do now, and I wouldn't be surprised if we hear her name in the supporting actress category for next year's Oscars. Leaving the theater a second time, I loved all of these things even more, and seeing it on a non-IMAX format allowed me to enjoy it simply as a movie rather than the almost overwhelming hypersensory experience it was the first time around. And that's when I truly understood my love for it. All of the weight of these emotional moments, the thrills of the action, the shots, the performances, felt like I'd embarked on an odyssey of my own. And knowing now that that was driven by the storytelling and not just the spectacle is what made this the Christopher Nolan movie that finally landed for me. I can't say this will unlock an understanding of his past work, but I do now have an appreciation for what he's been trying to reach because I feel like this is it. This movie is absolutely a pinnacle not only for him, but for a generation of filmmakers and film goers. Not to put too fine a point on it, but a movie with this much passion and this much craft making this much money is integral to the survival of real movies. Yes, it's a magnificent accomplishment, but it's also a giant middle finger to AI and the other movies that threaten to snuff out creativity and art as we know it. In short, this is easily my favorite film of the year, but it also made me hopeful. And for that, I suppose I have to say I'm grateful for not only Chris Nolan, but everyone involved for keeping this kind of filmmaking alive. This right here is truly what it's all about. And that is one last take on Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. Whether you agree or disagree with my take, I think everyone can agree that it's a movie worth talking about. And we don't get that every day. Next week should be an interesting one. I'll be covering the ever-divisive Nicholas Winding Refn's Her Private Hell, the recorded version of Broadway musical Hadestown, and a 70s-style actioner called Motor City. In the meantime, you can find more of my movie thoughts on one_last_take on Letterboxd. And as always, thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.